I only needed shelter. But this silent forge seemed to remember my family.
She was 20 and broke. No savings. No suitcase. No place to return. Just a canvas bag and $4 she had pressed flat inside her coat after walking away from the only work she knew. And with that $4, she bought a forgotten farrier's Horseshoe forge outside Lexington, Fayette County, Kentucky. A 19087 placed the county records no longer marked as active. The forge roof sagged over open rafters. The Bellows leather had split and collapsed. Fayette County condemned the structure in 2019, scheduling its demolition for the following spring unless someone claimed it before the season changed. Behind the intake valve of the massive leather bellows waited a sealed wooden compartment, untouched for decades, holding something that would alter the direction of Sadie's life. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Sadie Whitmore had been learning the language of old things her whole life without knowing it. She grew up on the edge of Kentucky horse country, where mornings began with fog over fence lines and the sound of hooves crossing packed dirt. Her mother worked long shifts, and her father was gone before she could remember him. What stayed with her were small routines, repairing a torn glove, saving a bent nail, watching older hands make broken things useful again. The person who noticed that patience in her was her grandfather, Thomas Whitmore, a quiet farrier who kept a small workshop behind his farmhouse. Every Saturday morning, Sadie sat beside him while he heated iron until it glowed orange, shaped horseshoes over the anvil, and listened for the sound that meant the metal was ready. Thomas never hurried the work. He showed her how a hoof carried weight, how a crooked shoe could change an animal's entire movement, and how a good craftsperson looked closely before touching anything. His old leather apron had a burn mark near the pocket, and he always tapped that mark before beginning. Every step matters when someone trusts your hands. He meant that craft was not about showing strength. It was about accepting responsibility for something that could not speak for itself. After Thomas died, the forge tools were divided among relatives who saw little value in worn iron. The old hammer disappeared. The trimming knife went missing. The handwritten notes about horses with injured legs were placed in a box that eventually vanished from the farmhouse attic. Sadie kept only memories of the sounds. Years later, she took work at a wealthy horse farm outside Lexington. The owner wore expensive boots and spoke softly when visitors arrived, but his kindness depended on obedience. As winter settled in, his requests became personal and his compliments became questions she did not want to answer. When Sadie refused to be cornered, the man's voice changed. By midnight, the job she depended on was gone. He accused her of taking feed for the horses, erased her remaining wages on paper, and told her she had no reason to expect anything from him. Her mother stood near the kitchen doorway while Sadie packed. She did not defend her. She did not move closer. The only thing Sadie carried from that room was her old canvas bag and the sound of the latch closing behind her. Leave tonight and never come back. Those 8 words were the only ones the farm owner gave her before turning away. For 6 weeks, Sadie lived wherever the next morning allowed. She slept beneath a picnic shelter in Georgetown, on a bus station bench in Louisville, and for several nights in an abandoned loading area behind a warehouse in Frankfurt. She washed in public restrooms, counted coins beneath streetlights, and watched $4 become 3, then 2, then a handful of change that barely covered coffee. The coldest night came near the end of January, when she slept under a highway overpass with her coat folded beneath her head. She kept her grandfather's old advice with her, not as comfort, but as a small instruction she could still follow. One afternoon, trying to escape the wind, she entered the public library in Lexington. Near the community board beside the local history shelves was a faded classified notice. It was not written to attract attention. It simply offered an abandoned farrier's forge for $4, provided the buyer accepted the responsibility of clearing the property. The address meant little at first. Then she saw the photograph attached to the notice, a small forgotten workshop, an old chimney, and a style of forge that looked familiar from her grandfather's stories. The next morning, Sadie used the last of her money for a bus ticket toward the place marked on the paper. She had no guarantee, no plan beyond a locked door she hoped might open, and no idea what waited behind the walls. The road ahead would lead her to a forge that had been silent for decades. When the bus left her at the edge of the county road, Sadie carried the deed folded inside her coat and walked the final miles with the same careful pace Thomas had taught her beside the anvil. The fields were quiet, the fences leaned toward the winter sky, and the abandoned forge waited somewhere beyond the trees. She did not know that the first night inside the old workshop would reveal a forgotten piece of her grandfather's world, or that the cold bellows beside the wall still held a secret someone had protected for a lifetime. The bus left Sadie 3 miles farther from the property than the county map suggested. The driver pointed toward the gravel road with one gloved hand and told her the nearest paved road was behind her. She adjusted the strap of her canvas bag and started walking beneath a pale February sky. The temperature was 11 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that her breath stayed visible between the bare trees. She walked 7 miles before reaching a small hay barn owned by a retired cattle farmer who allowed travelers to sleep in the corner when storms came through. The barn smelled of dry grass, old wood and leather harnesses. Sadie slept on a folded blanket beside stacked hay bales, listening to mice move behind the walls and the wind pushing against loose boards. Before sunrise she thanked the farmer, swept the corner where she had slept, and continued toward the road that led deeper into Fayette County. By late morning the landscape changed. The fields opened wider and the horse farms became more frequent. Lexington was built around horses, but the small roads beyond the city carried quieter traces of that history. Old fences followed creek lines. Stone markers stood near forgotten lanes. The work that once supported families still remained in the shapes of barns and workshops. When Sadie reached the nearest town, she stopped long enough to understand where she was. She passed Miller's Hardware, Bluegrass Feed and Supply, Harper's Cafe, Whitlock General Store, and the Lexington Tack Exchange, before finding the county clerk's office on the courthouse square. Each place carried its own rhythm: the scrape of boots on wooden floors, the bell above shop doors, the quiet conversations of people who knew one another by name. The county clerk's office occupied a brick building with tall windows and faded limestone steps. Inside, the air smelled of paper, floor polish, and old radiator heat. Sadie approached the front desk holding the folded purchase agreement carefully with both hands. The woman behind the counter looked up from a stack of property records. She was in her late 60s, with silver hair pinned behind one ear and a small scar across her left eyebrow. Her nameplate read, Evelyn Harper, County Records Clerk. She studied Sadie for a moment before looking down at the document. You understand this property has no utilities? Yes, ma'am. You understand the county condemned the structure? Yes, ma'am. You understand you're responsible for repairs, taxes, and removal of any unsafe materials? Yes, ma'am. You understand nobody is promising you anything beyond the deed. Sadie looked at the paper beneath her hand. Yes, ma'am. Evelyn Harper removed a brass stamp from a wooden drawer and pressed it into a red ink pad. The sound of the stamp meeting paper was quiet but final. She signed the transfer documents, slid them across the desk, and placed a small brass key beside them. The road is Old Mill Trace. Follow it until you see the creek bridge. After that, the property line begins where the walnut trees grow close together. Sadie picked up the key. You know this place? Evelyn asked. Not exactly. The clerk looked again at the surname printed on the deed. Whitmore. The room became still for a moment. Your grandfather was Thomas Whitmore. Sadie nodded. Evelyn removed her glasses and folded them slowly. I knew that name before I knew yours. She explained that Thomas had repaired horses throughout the county decades earlier. He was not famous, and he never wanted to be. People remembered him because he stayed late when a horse was injured, and because he accepted payment in whatever families could manage. Sometimes money, sometimes vegetables, sometimes nothing. The forge was his family's place before it became abandoned, Evelyn said. I always wondered who would finally come for it. Sadie held the deed more tightly. He never told me. Some people leave things behind because they are forgotten, Evelyn replied. Others leave things behind because they are waiting for the right person. The walk from the clerk's office took nearly an hour. Old Mill Trace narrowed from pavement into packed earth with winter grass bending along the edges. A neighbour named Walter Briggs was repairing a fence when Sadie passed. He wore a brown wool cap pulled low over his ears and carried a pair of rusted pliers in his coat pocket. You bought the old Whitmore forge? He asked. Sadie stopped. Yes. Walter looked toward the hills. Didn't think anybody would. His dog, a grey hound with a white patch over one eye, sniffed Sadie's boots before sitting beside Walter's leg. Good luck, Walter said. That place has been quiet a long time. The property appeared beyond a line of black walnut trees. The forge was smaller than Sadie imagined from the photograph, but heavier somehow, as though the building had settled into the earth instead of standing on it. The workshop measured roughly 24 feet by 30 feet, built from hand-cut oak beams and rough fieldstone. The roof sagged along the western side, covered with curled shingles darkened by decades of rain. A narrow brick chimney rose above one corner, leaning slightly but still holding its shape. Above the door hung a faded wooden sign with only a few unreadable letters remaining. Inside, the first thing Sadie noticed was the cold. The air had the dry stillness of a place closed for years. Her boots pressed into dust, layered across the floorboards. She touched the wall beside the entrance and felt rough timber beneath her fingers. Somewhere near the back room, a loose piece of metal moved with a small rusted click. The forge stood where the old records described it. The anvil remained beneath a sheet of canvas. Tools rested where their owners had last placed them. The bellows sat against the wall, large and collapsed. Its leather surface cracked like old river mud. The smell was a mixture of ash, iron, cedar, and something faintly sweet from the wood itself. Sadie opened the rear room and found enough space to place her bag on the floor. There was no bed, no electricity, and no running water. She gathered fallen wood from outside, swept a small area near the fireplace, and used her last matches carefully. That first night, she ate half a piece of bread she had saved and listened to the building settle around her. The wind moved through gaps in the roof. The old chimney whispered softly above her. She lay on a blanket beside the wall. Plum. other near the small brass key. She was alone, but for the first time in many weeks, she was inside something that had a door she could close. The old forge had been waiting for her. The first 3 days were not spent rebuilding, they were spent listening. Sadie learned where the roof leaked when the morning frost melted. She learned which floorboards complained beneath her weight and which ones stayed silent. She carried water from the old well after testing the rope and pulley, cleaned the abandoned outhouse behind the tree line, and marked the safest path through the property after dark. The forge had its own sounds. A board near the doorway clicked twice when the temperature dropped. The chimney gave a hollow knock when the wind came from the north. Near the back wall, Phone section of flooring creaked even when nothing touched it. She noticed that on the third evening, but she did not investigate. There were more immediate problems. On the fourth morning, Sadie walked into town carrying a list of basic supplies written on the back of an old envelope. She stopped at Miller's Hardware, the same store she had passed when arriving. The owner, a thin man named Harold Pike, stood behind the counter sorting nails into wooden bins. He had a missing tip on his left index finger and wore a faded blue work shirt with the sleeves rolled neatly above his elbows. The store smelled of pine boards, machine oil, and coffee that had been warming too long on a hot plate. Harold looked at her list. "You are the girl who bought the Whitmore forge." "Yes." He nodded slowly. "Thomas used to come here every month." Sadie looked up. He did, always bought the same things. Coal, leather strips, wire brushes. Never wasted a penny. Harold reached below the counter and pulled out a thin manual with a torn brown cover. "This belonged to my father. Basic repairs. Roofs, chimneys, old structures. I cannot pay for it. I did not ask." Sadie hesitated. "Why help me?" Harold placed the manual on the counter. "Because somebody helped people before you arrived." He opened a small account book and wrote her name. "Take what you need. Pay when you can." The first supplies were simple and practical. Roofing nails, $8.40. Chimney brush, $6.75. Wire brush set, $4.20. Lantern oil, $5.10. Work gloves, 30-50 cents. A small bag of mortar mix, $7.80. Sadie carried everything back herself. The next morning, she began with the chimney. The old brickwork had survived decades of weather, but the mortar between sections had turned soft. When she brushed the joints, grey powder fell like sand. She spent 6 hours removing loose creosote deposits from the inside using a steel chimney brush, lowering it slowly and turning it with controlled movements rather than forcing it. She learned the old chimney needed patience. The cleaning alone took 2 days. The first fire was not a dramatic moment. It was a careful one. Sadie placed dry wood in the fireplace, opened the damper, and watched the smoke rise. For several minutes, the room remained uncertain. Then the draft caught. The smoke moved upward instead of curling back inside. She sat beside the fire with a small iron pan and cooked beans over the heat. The meal was plain. It was also the first hot food she had prepared inside a place that belonged to her. After the chimney was safe, she turned toward the workroom. The room held pieces of another person's daily life, not a collection arranged for display, but tools left behind by someone who expected to return. There was a heavy anvil with a worn face from years of hammer strikes. A pair of blackened hoof nippers rested beneath a shelf. A wooden rasp handle had been polished smooth by another person's grip. A cracked leather apron hung beside the wall. A small measuring gauge sat near a box of square horseshoe nails. An old hammer with a curved wooden handle remained beneath the forge table. Sadie cleaned each item slowly. She did not try to make the room new. She tried to understand it. The strange floorboard near the back wall returned to her attention one rainy afternoon. The board gave a different sound when she tapped it. Not hollow exactly. Protected. She knelt and tested the surface with her fingertips. The plank was heavier than the surrounding wood. She measured the edges and found a narrow circular seam beneath years of dust. A cedar disc. Someone had cut the opening carefully and sealed it. Sadie did not pull immediately. She spent an hour clearing the surrounding dirt. Then she lifted the disc with the end of a small pry tool. Inside was a wrapped bundle. The first layer was oilcloth. The second was linen. Beneath that were tools, not ordinary tools. The handles were carved from walnut. The steel was marked with the initials TW. There was a small shaping hammer, a hoof knife, a set of precision files, and handwritten notes tied together with faded string. The final object was a tin box. Sadie opened it outside beneath the winter sky. Inside were folded certificates, several old coins, and a stack of carefully wrapped bills. She counted slowly, not because she doubted the number, because she needed time to understand what it meant. The total was $30,800. The coins were a mixture of pieces kept over generations: 3 silver Morgan dollars from 1898, 5 Indian head pennies from the early 1900s, 2 wheat pennies from 1917 and 1924, and a single Liberty nickel. Beneath them rested a military medal dated 1944. There was no celebration, no sudden transformation. Only a young woman sitting on the forge floor with old tools beside her, holding evidence that someone had planned for this moment long before she arrived. The money was important, but the tools felt heavier. They belonged to a person who had believed work could travel across time. That evening, Sadie placed the tin box beside her and did not open the folded letter tucked beneath the medal. Not yet. Instead, she stepped outside. The creek behind the property moved slowly beneath a thin layer of ice. The walnut branches stretched dark against the sky. She sat on a fallen log and listened to the water finding its way around the stones. The forge stood behind her, silent and dark, the old Bellows. The forgotten tools and the hidden compartment had not been waiting for someone wealthy. They had been waiting for someone willing to care. The forgotten farrier's forge had been waiting for her. The letter remained unopened until the following morning. Sadie waited until the sun reached the back wall of the forge before touching it. The paper was thick and yellowed at the edges, folded along the same lines for decades. When she lifted it from beneath the medal, she noticed the handwriting first. It was not Thomas's, but it carried the same careful pressure, the same deliberate spacing between words. She sat at the old workbench, where generations of hands had shaped iron, and unfolded the letter. My dear one, whoever you are, if this letter has reached your hands, then the forge has found someone who understands that old things are not valuable because they are old. They are valuable because someone cared enough to keep them alive. My name is Eleanor Whitmore. I was born in 1921 in Lexington, Kentucky, and I write this knowing I may never meet the person reading these words. In 1987, after months of weakness, I was diagnosed with pulmonary fibrosis. Dr. Margaret Collins at St. Joseph Hospital in Lexington confirmed what I already suspected. My lungs were failing, and the years ahead would be measured differently. I did not fear leaving this world as much as I feared leaving my work unfinished. The Whitmore line began with Samuel Whitmore, born in 1824 near Winchester, Kentucky, who learned ironwork from traveling smiths after the Civil War. His son James Whitmore, born in 1858, moved to Fayette County in 1881 and built the first version of this workshop beside the creek. James's daughter Clara Whitmore, born in 1893, preserved the farrier records and taught her son Thomas, born in 1919, the careful methods of shaping shoes for injured horses. 4 generations. 4 pairs of hands. One craft passed quietly. The trade officially closed on October 14th, 1987. After that day, the forge remained locked. More than 30 years passed with nobody entering this room. I kept the tools because I believed someone would come who understood that skill is not something a person owns. It is something a person protects until the next set of hands arrives. My husband, Robert, served in the United States Army and was lost during the Korean War in 1952. He left behind a family that had already learned the meaning of absence. I carried his memory the same way I carried these tools, carefully, without allowing grief to become the only thing left. If you wish to continue this work, begin slowly. A horseshoe is not shaped by force. Heat mild steel until it reaches approximately 1,600 degrees Fahrenheit. Then work quickly but deliberately while the color remains a bright orange. Keep the forge air steady. Too much oxygen wastes coal and weakens the surface. When shaping a shoe, maintain the original thickness of the stock. A balanced shoe begins with a balanced piece of iron. The crease for square nails should be centered carefully, leaving enough material near the edge to support the hoof. When repairing old leather bellows, mix 1 part natural oil with 2 parts beeswax for conditioning. Apply thin coats and allow each layer to rest overnight before adding another. When caring for injured horses, remember that the hoof grows slowly. A small correction made at the right time can prevent years of pain. The money hidden here was never meant to make someone wealthy. It was saved for restoration, for coal, for tools, for the patient work of keeping something honest. Inheritance is not what we receive. Inheritance is what we choose to continue. If you're reading this, perhaps you arrived here carrying something heavy. Perhaps the world told you that your hands were not enough. Do not believe it. Hands remember. They remember kindness. They remember patience. They remember the shape of work done with care. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You're welcome here. Eleanor Whitmore, October 14th, 1987. Sadie read the letter once. Then she read it again. The second time, she noticed the small marks beside certain sentences, places where Eleanor's pen had paused before continuing. When she finished, she folded the paper along the original creases, not making new ones. She returned it to the tin box. Then she walked through the back door of the forge. Behind the building, beside the creek, stood a flat stone half covered by moss. The letter had mentioned a marker, and she found the name carved into its surface, Thomas Whitmore. Below the name was a small line of dates and a simple phrase, farrier, teacher, keeper of steps. Sadie placed her hand against the stone. She did not speak. She stayed there until the cold reached through her gloves. That afternoon, she returned inside and lit the old lantern she had found beside the workbench. The glass was cloudy, and the metal frame carried scratches from years of use. When the flame caught, the room changed slowly. Not brighter, warmer. Over the following days, she noticed that the kindness surrounding the forge had never disappeared. Harold Pike at the hardware store continued leaving supplies on her account without asking when she would repay him. Walter Briggs repaired a section of fence near the creek after seeing her struggle with the posts. Evelyn Harper at the clerk's office mailed her a copy of the original property records in a protective folder. Even the farmer who had allowed her to sleep in his hay barn left a small bag of winter apples near the door when he passed by. They were small gestures. No speeches. No promises. Just people placing something useful into another person's path. Before we continue, take a moment and think about this. What is one small kindness someone gave you when you needed it most? Maybe it was a meal, A ride, a few words, or simply someone who noticed you were struggling. If you remember it, share it with us. That night, Sadie slept beside the workbench with the letter, the tools, and the medal carefully placed near her. The forge was still unfinished. The roof still leaked. The walls still needed repair. But the first thing she restored was something nobody could measure. A place where a person could begin again. The first snow arrived on December 3rd, 2022. 4 inches covered the roof before sunrise, turning the old forge into a quiet white shape beneath the walnut trees. Sadie carried Harold Pike's repair manual to the workbench and read the roofing chapter 3 times before touching a single shingle. The roof measured roughly 24 feet by 30 feet. She calculated the replacement carefully. 12 bundles of cedar shingles, 2 rolls of felt underlayment, and nearly 8 pounds of roofing nails. She wrote every measurement in Thomas's old notebook because guessing had no place in restoration. When she returned to Miller's Hardware, Harold disappeared into the back room and came out holding a small leather pouch. "My uncle's roofing hatchet," he said. "He would want it used." Sadie ran her thumb over the worn wooden handle. "I cannot afford this." Harold shook his head. "It is not for sale." The local elder who helped her was Walter Briggs's cousin, Raymond, a former roofer who walked with a slight bend in his back. He refused payment before Sadie even offered. "You are learning the right way," he said. For 11 days, they worked in cold air with their hands wrapped in wool gloves. Raymond showed her how to replace a damaged sister rafter, snap a straight chalk line, and drive nails with 3 controlled strokes instead of 1 heavy blow. "That nail's proud." Sadie looked at the raised nail head. "Pull it." Raymond nodded. "Now it will last." By mid-December, the last section of shingles was secured. Snow fell again that evening, but this time it stayed outside. January brought a different kind of repair. The chimney bricks had survived, but many were damaged by years of freezing and thawing. When Sadie removed the loose mortar, pieces crumbled between her fingers like dry soil. She rebuilt the joints using hydraulic lime mixed with fireclay in a careful 3-to-1 ratio, allowing each section to settle before moving higher. The work continued for 3 weeks while temperatures remained in the 20s Fahrenheit. Every 15 minutes outside, her bare fingers stiffened when she removed her gloves to feel the mortar consistency. She learned to work in small sections. A chimney was not repaired by rushing upward. It was repaired by keeping every layer honest. Near the end of January, she lit the test fire. She watched the smoke rise through the chimney opening. This time, it drew cleanly. No hesitation. No return into the room. The forge breathed again. The floorboards beneath the forge had survived better than expected. They were white pine, cut long before modern flooring machines existed. Some boards were warped, but most remained strong. Sadie removed damaged sections carefully and reused the original hand-cut rosehead nails wherever possible. For the remaining surface, she rented a random orbit sander from Harold for $14 a day. The work took patience. First pass, 80 grit. Second pass, 120 grit. Final pass, 220 grit. The dark surface slowly changed beneath the sanding dust. After cleaning, she applied 3 coats of oil finish, allowing 48 hours of curing between the final layers. The wood moved from years of darkness toward the color of deep honey, then settled closer to warm mahogany. One morning, after a week of rain, Sadie woke exhausted and unable to begin. She walked to the marsh behind the property and sat near the water. A great blue heron stood perfectly still among the reeds. She watched it for nearly an hour. She did no work that day. The next morning, she returned with cleaner hands. The windows were the next battle. There were 8 in total. 3 had no glass. 4 had cracks running through their panes. 1 remained almost untouched, holding its original glass from 1788. Sadie preserved that window exactly as she found it. The others required careful replacement. She learned to apply DAP 33 glazing putty with a steady knife, pressing the material into the frame without forcing it too thin. The old sash cords were gone. So she installed 1/4-inch cotton cord and tied the counterweights using a figure-8 knot that held firm without cutting into the fibers. Each repair changed the feeling of the room. Wind became quieter. Dust settled. Morning light returned. On the final window, Sadie worked until sunset. When she stepped back, she noticed movement outside. A small chickadee landed on a walnut branch directly beside the glass. It remained there for several seconds. Then it flew toward the creek. Sadie closed the window gently. The forge was beginning to hold warmth again. The walls inside the forge revealed their age after the windows were repaired. Beneath several layers of old paint, Sadie found hand-split oak lath covered with the remains of horsehair plaster. Near the chimney, 3 previous repairs had failed. Each patch had separated where heat and moisture had worked against the wall. She removed the loose sections and mixed fresh lime plaster with horsehair from a forgotten bag Harold Pike had found in the back of his warehouse. The first coat was the scratch coat, scored deeply so the next layer could hold. The second was a 3/8-inch brown coat that needed 72 hours before it could be touched again. The final finish coat was only 1/8 inch thick, spread carefully until the surface matched the older walls. The work was slow. The room changed by inches. When she finished smoothing the last section beside the fireplace, Sadie placed her palm against the wall. These patches will hold another 100 years. The forge became known quietly through the people who passed along the road. Doris, who owned Harper's Cafe, had a habit of leaving paper bags beside Sadie's door before sunrise. The bags held bread, soup, and sometimes a small jar of jam. When Sadie tried to pay her, Doris refused. "Pay me in candles when the shop reopens." She said it while wiping coffee cups, as though the matter had already been decided. Her hands smelled of cinnamon and soap. Caleb arrived one afternoon on an old Schwinn bicycle with a splitting maul tied across the back rack. He was 17, thin as a fence post, and wore a jacket that was clearly too large for him. "I brought this." Sadie reached for her wallet. He stepped back. "No." She looked at him. "My mother said, about your grandfather. He helped split fallen walnut branches for firewood and left before she could thank him properly. Reverend Boyd passed the forge almost every morning. He was tall, wore a dark coat with a missing button near the collar, and carried the same wooden cane through every season. He never entered. He simply stopped at the gate, tipped his hat, and offered the same 4-word prayer. "Keep her hands steady." Then he continued down the road. Sadie postponed the cellar until February 11th. The floor opening had always been there beneath a layer of boards, but she wanted the rest of the property stable before disturbing another hidden space. The cellar measured 12 by 15 feet, with a fieldstone floor and 7 granite steps descending beneath the workshop. At the center was a dressed granite slab. Carved into the stone was the same small craft mark found on several of Thomas's tools. Sadie cleaned the edges. She did not lift it. Some things deserved to remain closed until the right question arrived. While inspecting the 3rd step, she noticed a small gap beneath the stone edge. A narrow oak box had been wedged into the space. Inside was a brass key. The bow of the key was shaped like the symbol used by generations of Whitmore farriers. Beneath it rested a tintype photograph from 1903. The image showed a young woman standing outside the cottage, holding a tool beside the old workshop wall. Sadie stared at the photograph for a long time. The woman's face carried a resemblance she could not explain. On the back, written in faded ink, were the words, Clara Whitmore, daughter of James Whitmore, age 25, summer of 1903. Sadie placed the key on the mantel above the fireplace. She did not know what it opened. She decided she did not need to know yet. By March, the snow began disappearing. The creak grew louder. Small green shoots appeared near the walnut trees, and the branches filled with pale catkins before the leaves returned. Sadie considered opening the forge as a working farrier shop immediately. She decided against it. The letter had never told her to hurry. That spring, she would not begin full repairs for horses. She would practice. She would study. She would spend 1 coin from the hidden money on materials and use small pieces of iron until her hands understood the work again. The forge had survived because people respected time. She would do the same. The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later, in December 2024, Sadie completed her first heritage craft object. It was not a horseshoe for a famous horse. It was a small iron hook designed from an old Whitmore pattern, forged slowly from a square bar heated in the restored forge. She brought the iron to working temperature, shaped the curve over the anvil, punched the hole while the metal was ready, and finished the surface with careful filing. The object was simple, a hook for hanging tools beside the door. But when she placed it on the wall, she understood why Thomas had valued the smallest pieces of work. The purpose was not to create something impressive. The purpose was to create something dependable. Inside, the forge no longer looked abandoned. The floorboards carried the warmth of finished wood. The windows held morning light. The repaired walls showed the texture of careful hands. The old anvil remained near the centre, surrounded by tools that were clean but still marked by use. Nothing had been polished away completely. The history remained visible. The brass key stayed above the fireplace until one December morning when Sadie finally followed another clue. The craft mark on the key matched a small metal plate hidden beneath the bark of the oldest walnut tree near the creek. She removed the plate carefully. Behind it was a narrow wooden compartment. Inside rested a folded 48-star American flag and another handwritten note. The paper was dated June 25th, 1950, during the first day of the Korean War. It was from Eleanor's sister Clara, written after Robert Whitmore left for military service. The note did not speak about glory. It spoke about waiting. It described a family that continued working while someone they loved was away. It described horses needing care, fields needing planting, and a workshop that remained lit every evening because an empty chair did not mean an empty home. Sadie folded the note and placed the flag beside the military medal. On July 27th, 2024, the anniversary of the Korean Armistice Agreement, she carried the medal to a small military cemetery outside Lexington. She placed flowers beside Robert Whitmore's marker and stood there quietly. No ceremony followed. Only respect. The money from the hidden compartment remained mostly untouched. Sadie used 3 silver coins and 2 older pennies over the years for small restoration materials. The rest was sealed inside a new wooden box beneath the workbench. A note was placed on top. For the next one, the forge reopened quietly. There was no announcement. No newspaper article. Doris placed an index card on the cafe corkboard. Whitmore Heritage Craft. Small repairs. OLD methods. BY appointment. Within months, More than 40 names were written on the mailing list. Most wanted to learn. Some wanted to remember. Caleb returned one spring carrying a hand-carved wooden sign. He had grown taller, his shoulders broader, and the Schwinn bicycle had been replaced by an old truck. The sign read, "Whitmore Farrier Works, Daughters." Sadie smiled when she saw it. "You made this?" He shrugged. Seemed right. She hung it beside the door. Years after opening Eleanor's letter, Sadie began writing one of her own. She used the same first words. "My dear one, whoever you are." She wrote about the creek, the tools, the people who had helped her, and the importance of leaving something useful behind. She did not know who would eventually read it. That was not the point. The point was that someone might, the old forge, the forgotten tools, and the careful hands that restored them had never been waiting for someone perfect. They had been waiting for someone willing to continue. The forgotten farrier's forge had been waiting for her. When visitors asked why she kept the original damage instead of replacing every worn piece, Sadie gave the same answer. Because the marks show that someone was here, and that was enough. The farrier's Horseshoe forge waits. It has always waited. The old building beside the creek continued holding mornings, winters, and the quiet sounds of work returning. Some places are not abandoned when people leave. They simply remain until another person understands what they were built to protect. In the county clerk's office, inside a wooden drawer beneath the old property records, Evelyn Harper kept one final reminder, a $4 bill, the same one Sadie had used when she first claimed the forge. It remained there, folded carefully between 2 pages, not as proof of what Sadie lost, as proof of what she carried.